They say it all sounds reasonable, logical, makes sense, right up until religion enters the conversation. Right there. That's the line. But notice what is actually being revealed in that moment. Because if everything up to that point is accepted as reasonable, then reason has not broken. Something else has. And instead of recognizing that, it gets flipped. Suddenly it becomes religion is where reason stops. No, that is not where reason stops. That is where their reason stops following. That is where their framework stops keeping up, not the argument, them. Because up to that point, everything feels fine to them. Everything sounds logical. Everything feels acceptable. And then religion enters the discussion, and suddenly the brakes come on. The conversation is no longer being evaluated. It is being filtered through assumptions, filtered through prejudices, filtered through centuries of inherited biases, masquerading as reason. And that is the problem, because they do not get to impose upon Muslims the intellectual baggage of their own history. They do not get to take the scars left behind by an irrational religious experience in the West and project them onto every religious civilization on earth. That history is theirs, not ours. Religion did not suffocate critical thought in our civilization. Religion did not strangle scientific inquiry in our civilization. Religion did not stand in opposition to reason in our civilization. The civilization that produced towering scholars across mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, jurisprudence, engineering, physics, and countless other disciplines was not built despite religion. It was built by religious people, people whose faith and intellect walked side by side. So when religion enters the conversation and confidence suddenly evaporates, that is not evidence against religion. It is evidence that their framework has reached the point beyond which it cannot follow. And here is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because it is said, why bring religion into it? But that is not the real question. The real question is, why is secularism brought into it without question? Why is atheism treated as neutral? Why are secular assumptions allowed to sit in the room unnoticed while religion alone is ordered to leave before reasoning is permitted to proceed? Who made that rule? Who decided that secularism is reason and religion is bias? Who granted atheism diplomatic immunity from scrutiny? The answer is simple. It was assumed, repeated, normalized, and eventually mistaken for truth. So what is really happening is simple. Their reasonableness can only travel with us up to a certain point. Then it runs out. Not because the arguments stop working, but because their framework stopped extending that far. And that is where another uncomfortable reality appears. Because the last people on earth who should be lecturing humanity about reason, logic, and moral superiority are the self-appointed guardians of the so-called Enlightenment, the civilization that constantly claims ownership of reason, the civilization that endlessly markets itself as the triumph of logic over faith. A civilization whose trail through history is stained with catastrophe after catastrophe. And here is the question nobody wants to answer. If religion supposedly makes no sense, Then what exactly was the rationale behind the genocides? What was the logic behind extermination? What was the reason behind slavery? What was the intellectual brilliance behind colonialism? Where was the reason when Native American civilizations were shattered? Where was the logic when Africans were systematically dehumanized and enslaved for centuries? Where was the moral clarity when populations were exterminated in Namibia, in the Congo, in Algeria? Where was this celebrated rationality when Europe consumed itself and millions of Jews were marched toward industrialized death? Where was this superior framework when Muslims were massacred in Bosnia? Where is it now? Right now? In Gaza, where the claims of reason and moral superiority are being tested against the reality of mass slaughter, ethnic cleansing and genocide. Because if religion is automatically disqualified for entering the discussion, then by what standard are these horrors justified? What philosophical equation produces genocide as a reasonable outcome? What secular theorem concludes that entire populations may be crushed beneath the machinery of power? What magnificent achievement of reason transforms mass death into policy? Because this is where the story falls apart. Everything sounded reasonable, everything sounded logical, right up until the genocidal mass murder. That is where the claims collapse. That is where the framework collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Not because reason failed, but because the people claiming ownership of reason failed. So no, they are not going to dictate what Muslims can discuss. They are not going to define the limits of our discourse. They are not going to decide which assumptions may be questioned and which must remain sacred. And they are certainly not going to convince us that religion is irrational merely because their framework cannot continue once religion enters the room. That is not a failure of religion. It is a confession that the framework claiming to be universal was never universal at all. It simply reached its limit, and instead of admitting that limit, it called the territory beyond it irrational. But the roadblock was never in religion. It was always in the framework that refused to go any further.